Hello, everybody. Nice to see a lot of old friends up there. This talk was one that I prepared for a group of forestry folks. And we thought it was useful to present it here as a kind of one possible model that we might use as the aware people move forward in collaboration with some folks in Uganda, where they're trying to develop curriculum that is specifically focused on a particular discipline. And so we thought this would, or I should say the aware folks, thought this might be a good example to at least look at as one way to go about it. I got to see how this works. The topic of the talk is People and Forest Trajectory, 1994 to 2004, What Next? And I picked those dates because that's the period in which I have been, during which I have been totally enmeshed in the forestry world. Hope that didn't work. There we go. I'm going to start with a little bit of discussion about the growth of the interest in forests and people within the forestry world, and then give some examples, primarily from CIFOR, that's the Center for International Forestry Research, that I consider to be encouraging or useful in thinking about people and forests. And then about halfway through the talk, I'll switch over to talking more about gender issues, giving a few methodological considerations for forestry people to think about who aren't used to the kinds of methods that we use in social science. And then conclude with a little bit about why bother. The World Forestry Congress is probably, I guess it's the biggest forestry gathering, and it meets every 5 years. And in 1978, there was a kind of a watershed when they identified forests and people, forests for people rather, as an important theme, or the main theme for the whole conference. In 1985, they added the idea of looking at youth, paying attention to youth, and then in 1991, they talked about forest heritage, which is, of course, a people-oriented concern. In the new millennium, they started thinking more broadly about sustainability, and in 2003, they looked at forests for people, forests for the planet, and people and forests in harmony. So it's getting more and more integrated into their thinking. And the next one, which comes up next year, will be Forests and People Investing in a Sustainable Future. So there's been a lot of progress within the forestry field toward looking at people's roles and what forestry does for people. One example of this is the work at CIFOR, but it's an atypical example. When CIFOR began, the people who started the institution had a number of ideas in mind, and one of them was that the institution should be policy-oriented. They were really aware that what's happening in the forest is not only impacted by or affected by the forest itself, the people who are managing that particular forest, but rather the broader context of forest management. They were also very committed to interdisciplinary work. And so CIFOR has always had a lot of different disciplines involved. And it's been unlike many of the CG centers in that the voices of social scientists have been actually listened to, which is very refreshing if you happen to be a social scientist. They also want to look at research at all scales. I'm an anthropologist, as most of you know, or many of you know. And so my real interest is in looking at the village scale. But they've had research at all different scales, and I've even gotten dragged into some of the broader scale sorts of research as well. And then lastly, they realized that human and ecological concerns were also very important, and we should be looking at that besides just forest-related issues. So I'm just going to give you some examples of some of the research that I think is useful for moving forward on people and forests, which I consider to be really important if we're thinking about sustainability of forests. The first one has to do with human well-being. In the early or the mid-90s, I guess, we had a project called Criteria and Indicators for Sustainable Forest Management. And this was a project trying to sort of define what do we mean by sustainable forest management, because it's a nice word, a nice phrase rather, but we were pretty uncertain. And it did have some influence because within the program, we divided into ecological, sort of forest management in the traditional sense, and human well-being. And so this opened up, in a lot of the foresters' eyes, it opened up the idea of even thinking about human well-being. And so I think that one was rather influential. More recently, they've had a project called the Poverty and Environment Network, which has involved research looking at, it's a standardized questionnaire that was applied in forests all over the tropics. And the people administering these questionnaires were, by and large, they were PhD candidates who were in the field, living in communities, and then doing this on top of their regular PhD work. So it's unusually, you know, it's good in the sense of being quantitative plus qualitative. And the analyses from this research are coming out now. So there's some interesting stuff coming out of it at this point. Another kind of approach that we've used, not exclusively, but as part of the repertoire, I'd say, is working collaboratively with communities. And some of you have heard me talk about adaptive collaborative management, which was a program that I led for several years. The idea of that program was to work very much at the community level with communities, trying to figure out with them what are their goals, what are some avenues toward those goals, and institute a kind of adaptive process where you have a analysis, planning, monitoring, and reevaluation. And you do this in a kind of cyclical way with the idea of really helping people to be more adaptive in their management. And then some of the RED work. RED is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And it's a very popular topic in the forestry world, and not so popular among some other groups of people. But they've used, in some of the programs that are looking at RED, have used action research approaches. These are just some pictures of some of our working with women. The vertical one is from Sumatra, and the horizontal one is from Kalimantan. Then we've also looked at people's knowledge. So this is some of the adaptive collaborative management work. The idea for that, one of the ideas for that, was that if we're working closely with communities, we can build on what they know about their habitats and about the animals in their forest, the plants in their forest. And so trying to understand what do people already know about the forests in which they live, and how can we marry that with what scientists know about the forests, has been an ongoing concern. In the late 1900s, 1990s rather, there was a program that looked at non-timber forest products. And when that started, there wasn't a lot of attention to non-timber forest products. There's been more and more interest in that as time has gone by, and as we've realized how important they are in people's subsistence, well, also and for sale. That particular program or project was looking at commercial uses of non-timber forest products. But the material coming out of that Poverty and Environment Network study that I mentioned earlier is showing, as I'm not surprised to find, that subsistence is extremely important in terms of their uses of non-timber forest products. And the last one I wanted to mention was this focus on power relations. A lot of social scientists are realizing that we really need to be looking at power relationships, both in terms of ethnicity and in terms of gender. And so we've been trying to do that. And the last one is this issue of decentralization and devolution studies. In the early 2000s, a lot of countries were decentralizing, and so they were passing over authority from the central government to lower levels. And so we wanted to look at that process in different countries and see how it was affecting the people who lived in those areas. And this is just some examples of involving officials. Again, we have, this is at the village level on the vertical one, and the horizontal one is at the district level, where a lot of our work has also been. There's also been a more controversial set. Those ones I just talked about were projects that were sort of big and important within the institution. These are things we looked at a little more in a more haphazard way. But Swidden agriculture, as you may know, among foresters anyway, it's kind of a bad word. It's the same thing as shifting cultivation or slash and burn agriculture. But many of the Swidden systems are extremely complex and adaptable and actually sustainable if you have a low population density. So we tried to look at that and think about ways to kind of overcome this kind of knee-jerk negative reaction that we encounter a lot. Human health. When we started looking at that, because there were some questions, well, are forests good for people's health or are they bad for people's health? Because you get lots of food from the forest, you get all kinds of products from the forest, medicines, but also you get Ebola from the forest. And so we were kind of interested in looking into that in a little more depth. And so we've done some on that. There's still plenty more to do, of course. Nutrition, again, the question of people obtaining subsistence from the forest, which is very common. We wanted to look at that, and some of that has been going on recently. We had a nutritionist involved. And then the last one, population. And I think I'll talk about that a little bit more, but it plays, the availability of birth control plays an important, a really critical role in women's life chances. I mean, I think of my own situation. If I hadn't been able to control my fertility, what opportunities would I have had, and not just me. But I just bring us back to reality. Those were examples that I think are important and useful for looking at sustainability in forests, but these are not typically addressed in developing country forestry institutions, and also often not in Western ones as well. There's usually little or no community experience or training. There's usually a single-minded concentration on timber. So timber has been the thing that foresters, focus on for a long time. And there's been, over the last few decades, there's been a growing interest in looking at it more holistically and including non-timber forest products and biodiversity. But that's sort of trickling out to developing countries pretty slowly. And so most of them that I've been in touch with have been very much focused on timber. There's almost never any social scientists. And there's usually antagonism to local people. They're called poachers or slash and burn farmers or illegal loggers or various names that don't suggest that there's any opportunity for working constructively with them. And what's happened? The forests are still in decline. Human well-being hasn't improved. It's improved some, of course, and it's variable from place to place, but we still could use a lot more improvement, and that's particularly true, I think, in forest areas which are remote and therefore a little bit lower priority on a lot of government, government budgeting. And then the benefits continue to be very inequitably distributed. Forest people tend to be among the least powerful in the developing world anyway, and so it's kind of hard for them to defend any rights they might have or claims they might have. So I think truly sustainable forest management remains a chimera. So this has made me think a little bit more about the issue of women in forests. There's tons of evidence. There's just every time, I've been doing literature reviews recently, one after another on various topics and gender. And there's tons of information out there showing how involved women actually are in a variety of ways in forests. But it doesn't seem to get integrated into the forestry world, into the thinking in forestry. But what that means is that we've been ignoring half of the world's population, both their needs, their possible contribution, what they know about. But I think one of the problems has been that we've tended to look at women alone. Gender has equaled women, and that's not really what it means. We really need to be looking at both. And I think if we did look at both, that would help us to integrate the findings that we develop into the forestry world more effectively. I think we need to look at the relations between men and women. And I think we need to look at several topics that have been very taboo in the forestry world. And not only in the forestry world, so I don't mean to be picking on them. They're taboo in a lot of different contexts. The first elephant in the room is the issue of population. Almost any biophysical scientist that you talk to will tell you that population growth or population density are really big problems if you're looking at forests, if you're trying to manage the forest in a sustainable way. On the other hand, women who don't have access to birth control have very limited options. So here we have a kind of win-win situation, and yet nobody's been willing to talk about it. In very recent times, I occasionally hear something about it, but for probably several decades, it's been kind of taboo, and I think we need to change that. The second elephant in the room is the issue of the domestic or the reproductive. I know many people don't like using those terms, feeling that it's sort of reinforcing this division between productive and reproductive, which is kind of an arbitrary division. But really, if we want women to be involved in activities outside the home, whether that's education or income generation or collective action or politics or sustainable management, men really need to get more involved in the home. There's study after study that shows that women have longer working hours than men in most places, and so we need to think about that. This guy, Gary Barker, is a men in development specialist, and he says engaging men in caregiving is nothing less than a fundamental reworking of our work-life balance and our beliefs and in the purpose of our lives and relationships. And I think that's true, but it doesn't mean that we don't need to start. And the last elephant in the room I wanted to mention is this one of violence against women. For most of my professional time of working on gender, I didn't pay much attention to this, partly because I've been lucky and haven't been subjected to violence, but also because I worked with people in Indonesia particularly, where domestic violence was pretty rare. We just did a study in southern Sulawesi where almost nobody approved of it, and most people apparently do not do it, and I kind of can believe that from having lived in rural areas in Indonesia. But other places, it's really ubiquitous. In South Africa, it's horrendous, the levels of violence against women, and women who are subjected to that kind of violence, or even who witness it, are much less likely to be willing to take risks, to move outside their comfort zone, or particularly outside the comfort zone of their spouse. So I think we need to be addressing that in the areas at least where it's a problem. So then I switched to why should forest researchers venture into these topics? And I personally think that enhancing sustainability will require us to pay attention to those subjects. We want to make sure that we do no harm, which we've been doing a lot of harm by not being aware, not purposeful harm, but harm by not being aware of how women and men are using the forest. And for a long time, we weren't paying any attention to people at all. Now we're at least trying to talk sometimes to the men, but we don't very often try to talk to the women as well. So we need to change that. We need to strengthen people's motivation to maintain or improve forests by ensuring more equitable distribution of benefits. And I think that would really help in in strengthening such motivation. And the last one that I think is really important is catalyzing these people's creativity. We want to increase the people's power to do things, and including women's, because it's a whole resource that we've not been paying any attention to, and we really need to do that, I think. So how can we do it? For one thing, it's kind of a fundamental thing when you're thinking of forestry is most foresters think in terms of conventional experimental designs. And that's not a format in which it's very easy to look at gender. You really need to be thinking about some of these kind of fuzzy concepts like culture, a complex whole, knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and other learned capabilities and habits. That's an old definition, but it still represents something out there in the world. Admittedly, now it has fuzzier edges than we used to think, and it also evolves more than we used to think it did. But it's something that really has an effect on people's behavior. Norms, these are standards or patterns, especially of social behavior, that are typical and expected of a group, yeah. So what people expect women to do, for instance, is in some groups, is stay out of the forest. Well, that may be a problem for them. Values, a person's principles or standards of behavior, one's judgment of what is important in life. Both of these kinds of issues affect people's behavior and what they're willing and able to do. And I'm going to give you some examples from some research that we're doing now. This research is looking at landscape management in southern Sulawesi. It's in 5 villages in 2 provinces. And there's 3 components, and one of them looks at governance, and so that's where we were, that was the part that this research comes from. The Bugis, the Makassar, and the Tolaki are 3 ethnic groups that reside in this area. The Bugis and Makassar have this very central concept of honor, and a family's honor is very dependent on a woman's behavior. It's also dependent on man's behavior, but if we think about the women's situation, it reduces their options for involvement in the forest. the Makassar, the Tolaki, and also the Bugis. I've neglected to put them on there as well. But for all three of these groups, women rather than men are considered the legitimate managers of household finance. So everybody goes out and makes money. Men make more money than women. Everybody gives the money back to the woman and have a little cigarette money, they call it, for the man to buy cigarettes or do whatever he wants. So that really means that women have cash to invest. But nobody pays attention to the women, and so this possible investment that might occur in forest management by women is missed. In this group, in all of these groups, we found that women spoke up publicly to varying degrees. But in some groups, they reported near gender equality. So women may have unrecognized power. In fact, I'm sure they do have unrecognized power in these groups. And the last one I wanted to mention is the Tolaki. These are a group of people that other Indonesians would definitely consider to be primitive. Most other Indonesians have never even heard of them. They're not a famous ethnic group. But they manifest a strong sense of everyone's right to be heard, to be involved in decision making. So these people could provide a more gender equitable example for managing forests in a more democratic way. This is in distinct contrast to the other ethnic groups, the Bugis Makassar, who have a very hierarchical structure in which having white blood, which is rather like having blue blood in the European situation, allows you to have access to leadership roles. So all of these things have an influence on people's behavior and how forests can, should, and are managed. So I give some examples here that for foresters to think about in terms of methods that can be useful in looking at people. One of them is conventional academic studies. Though these are reliable, they're often couched in very alien jargon. I was giving the example of my husband rolling his eyes, although he denies this, when he looked at my American Anthropologist, which is, a lot of the articles are quite full of jargon. But also they require more time. These kinds of studies require more time, or require a lot of time. And very often the findings come too late to have an influence in the policy sphere. So that's one of the problems. I'm not saying we shouldn't do them. I'm just saying there are some significant problems. Participatory rural appraisal is another approach that gets around the time issue. And it's very good for exposing policymakers and others to the realities of rural life. But it's very easy to get misleading results. You know, the big shots come in, they look around, and then they're told whatever, in some cases, they are told what the people think they would like to hear. And so that's a danger. The two approaches that I like, and maybe it's very predictable since I'm an anthropologist, are the ethnographic approaches, but I put in bold those trained in the method because I've found that in many fields, there's an idea that ethnographic research means you go out and hang out in the village for 3 days, or maybe 2 weeks. But that isn't it, of course. It requires some training, it requires a longer period of time. But if you do that, you can get holistic and reliable information that can be very useful for thinking about how to manage a forest better. And then the last one I wanted to mention are participatory approaches, but again, I emphasize by people who are trained in those approaches, because we were talking earlier about the skills of facilitation. Well, if you want to do good participatory research and action, either one, you have to be able to facilitate processes with groups of people. And so anyway, those approaches I think do allow us to learn about where the people are, what things are important to them, and what things they are capable and interested in doing, which if we want something to be sustainable, we have to pay some attention to. So in conclusion, I think we have a lot of work to do. I think we have to think about the assumptions that we have about men and women and what they do and what they want. We have to gather a lot of information and analyze it, both focused information and holistic information. And we also need to go a little further in thinking about how to integrate what we're learning into the ongoing forest management processes. Where now arbitrary and culturally prescribed gender roles have inordinate power to determine and preclude life chances for both men and women, we can and should work toward a forest world in which women's and men's strengths, interests, and voices can structure their own lives and their interactions with forest landscapes. I really think it would be worth the effort to try. That's all.